There is a particular kind of fury that ignites not when you defy someone, but when you detach from them entirely. It is a cold, smoldering fire, born from the realization that the strings they believed were tied to your limbs have been quietly snipped away. This rage is not explosive at first. It is a silent, gnawing obsession, a deeply personal offense taken against your very peace. She wasn't merely angry. She was incensed by your stillness, by your refusal to perform the dance of distress she had choreographed for you. Your lack of pleading, your absence of reaction, your steady refusal to shrink, these were not just disappointments. They were existential threats, and from that threat grew one focused, venomous goal, your annihilation. For when a person constructs their sense of self upon the plinth of controlling another, your independence reads as treason. Your healing is an affront. Your silence is the ultimate rebellion. So she embarked on a relentless campaign, scouring the landscape of your shared history for weapons. She dissected old conversations under a microscope of malice, bending facts into plausible fictions, recruiting bystanders as unwitting allies in her private war. She built a case in her mind, a narrative where she was the righteous corrector of a grave injustice. But the truth was murkier, living in the shadows she refused to acknowledge. She failed to grasp a fundamental law. Destruction fueled by bitter resentment always, eventually, turns inward. Rage clouds judgment, narrows vision, and trades wisdom for the cheap thrill of impulse. And while she was meticulously plotting your downfall, you were engaged in an act far more dangerous to her designs. You were reconstructing yourself. This is the profound irony. As she watched you with a bitterness that tinted her world, measuring your life against the scale of her own wounds, you were quietly doing the sacred work of integration. You were learning, without self-flagellation but with clear-eyed honesty, where you had faltered, where you had tolerated the intolerable, where you had traded fragments of your own values for the counterfeit coin of temporary peace. You were growing stronger, not through the empty promise of revenge, but through the solid ground of responsibility. And responsibility is the one force that chaos, in all its frantic noise, can never overpower. She anticipated your collapse. She waited for public humiliation, for emotional disintegration, for you to retaliate and thus validate her story. She had a script and she had cast you perfectly, but you declined the role. You remained rooted. You kept your focus. You chose the quiet dignity of your own integrity over the addictive drama of her battlefield. This shocked her to her core, for those who wield manipulation as a tool require emotional reactions to fuel their engine. They need chaos to feel potent. When met with silence, their entire system falters. Slowly, inevitably, cracks began to spiderweb across her facade. Her stories lost their internal consistency. The sharp edge of her anger, once hidden in private, began to slice into public view. The harder she tried to expose you, the more she revealed the trembling hand holding the lens. Rage has a way of seeping through the finest masks. It betrays itself in a tightened tone, in poorly timed accusations, in a disproportionate fervor that makes observers subtly lean away. They notice. They always do. Here is a difficult truth many prefer to avoid. When someone is hell-bent on ruining you, they often end up staging a meticulous exhibition of their own character. And character, once unveiled, cannot be hidden again. What stunned her most was not the failure of her plan, but the reason for its failure. It failed because you refused to morph into the monster her narrative demanded. You refused to breathe life into her caricature of you. You did not chase her approval or wrestle with her accusations. You stood, unwavering, in the truth of who you were becoming. That steadfastness acted as a spotlight, making her rage look precisely like what it was, desperate, flailing panic. There is something profoundly disorienting about encountering a person who will not play the game, who cannot be baited, who refuses to marinate in bitterness. Such composure becomes an unasked-for mirror, forcing a reflection that is terrifying to anyone sprinting from their own shadow. So instead of destroying you, she was compelled to face something unbearable. Her efforts did not lift her up, they diminished her. Her anger did not empower her, it exposed her. Your silence did not weaken you, it became your unassailable fortress. This is not a fable about cosmic payback. This is human psychology, plain and stark. When people operate from resentment, they outsource their responsibility. When their tactics fail, they double down, digging the hole deeper. And eventually, reality intervenes. Reality always intervenes. You became living, breathing proof that she was wrong about your fragility, wrong about your worth, wrong about the permanence of her control. With every step you took forward, her narrative crumbled a little more behind you. The true victory, then, is not that she was shocked, but that you were irrevocably transformed. You learned that strength does not announce itself with thunder. It does not issue threats. It does not beg for validation. Strength is built in the private quarters of the soul, in the discipline of restraint, in choosing the long, winding road when the short cut offers a tempting, hollow satisfaction. You learned that being underestimated can be a formidable strategic advantage. And you learned that integrity, though it moves with a slow, deliberate pace, is relentless and unstoppable. Let this be the wisdom you carry. Not everyone who offers a smile wishes for your success. Not everyone standing close supports your growth. And when someone reveals their capacity to seek your destruction, believe them. But in that believing, do not become them. For the most devastating reply to someone who wants to ruin you is not a counterattack. It is to become so grounded, so capable, so directed by your own inner compass that their hatred becomes irrelevant, a faint static in the background of a life lived fully. She aimed to ruin you. Instead, she became the whetstone against which you were sharpened. And that is a truth she will have to reconcile long after her anger has burned down to cold ash. Her rage did not emerge from a vacuum, and it certainly did not spring from a place of justice. It was born in the precise moment she sensed a fundamental shift in the tectonic plates of your relationship. You were no longer dependent on her reactions, her validation, or her emotional permission to exist. For someone who measures their worth by the yardstick of control, this is a terrifying revelation. When control evaporates, panic floods in, and that panic quickly crystallizes into a hard, sharp rage. Individuals like this do not see relationships as shared journeys. They view them as ecosystems of leverage. Attention is their currency. Emotion is their weapon of choice. Vulnerability is a bargaining chip to be exploited. For a long time, whether you were fully aware or not, she benefited from your willingness to explain yourself, to soothe, to bend. Your empathy was the source of her power. Your patience constructed her comfort. Your moments of self-doubt reinforced her sense of superiority. This unspoken arrangement held until it shattered. The moment you stopped reacting according to her script, the illusion fractured. You did not argue with more heat. You did not plead for understanding. You did not run after a closure she was never equipped to give. Instead, you performed the most powerful act of all. You withdrew your emotional energy. That withdrawal felt to her like a profound abandonment and a deep humiliation, fused into one. Not because you had harmed her, but because you had removed the very resource she relied upon to regulate her own sense of importance. This is where the fatal misunderstanding took root. From her vantage point, your silence looked like arrogance. Your newly drawn boundaries felt like punishment. Your calm demeanor seemed like cruelty. She could not interpret your growth as maturity because to do so would force her to confront her own stagnation. So she authored a new story. In this revised edition, you were cast as the villain, and villains in her mind deserve to be dismantled. Rage thrives on these distorted narratives. It simplifies complex human messiness into a stark battle of good versus evil. It erases nuance. It justifies excess. Once she convinced herself you were heartless, ungrateful, or disloyal, any action she took felt righteous. Gossip transformed into truth-telling. Sabotage became self-defense. Cruelty masqueraded as holding you accountable. This is how ordinary resentment metastasizes into a crusade. But beneath the armor of her justification lay one unbearable fact she could not escape. You were no longer controllable. Control is addictive. It offers a counterfeit sense of stability in a chaotic world. When someone bases their identity on being needed, admired, or feared, losing that position feels like a psychological death. It isn't merely about losing you, it's about losing the mirror you once held up to her. Without your reactions, she had to face herself. And what she saw, she could not abide. So the rage escalated. She hunted for pressure points. She combed through your past, looking for regrets to weaponize. She magnified your flaws and minimized your virtues. She tried to provoke you into an outburst, longing to say, "See, this is the real you." But you withheld that satisfaction, and your restraint infuriated her more than any insult ever could. Here is the paradox that forever eludes people like her. The more aggressively they strive to regain control, the more they broadcast their own desperation. Rage is loud. It leaks. It reveals itself in poor timing, a strained tone, and sheer excess. Meanwhile, quiet strength appears deceptively simple on the surface, yet it carries immense gravitational weight. You felt no need to convince anyone of anything. You let your consistency speak for you. What she failed to grasp is that control over another person is always a temporary illusion. It relies on a foundation of fear, confusion, or dependency. The moment someone chooses self-responsibility over external approval, that control dissolves. And when it dissolves, all that remains is the raw, unmediated emotion that the power dynamic had masked. In her case, that emotion was a deep well of resentment. Your independence presented her with a truth she had avoided for years, that her influence was conditional, her authority a granted lease that expired the moment you stopped renewing it. Once you stopped believing in it, it vanished. Instead of grieving that loss and growing from it, she chose to punish you for it. But punishment only holds power when the target acknowledges the judge's authority. You did not. You chose to live by your own internal code. You acknowledged your flaws without letting them define you. You took responsibility for your future instead of litigating the past. In doing so, you stepped entirely outside the arena of her rage. That is why her anger seemed so intensely personal, so relentless. It was not about winning a dispute. It was about desperately trying to restore a sense of dominance that had already slipped through her fingers. She was fighting a battle that had already ended against an opponent who had quietly left the field. This is the silent, aching truth beneath her fury. She did not hate you because you were weak. She hated you because you had become free. While she was consumed by the need to damage you, something far more significant was unfolding in the quiet beneath the surface of your life. You were not standing still, a stationary target. You were not waiting for external justice, validation, or an apology that might never come. You were engaged in the slow, unglamorous, utterly vital work of rebuilding yourself. That kind of work rarely makes a sound, but it changes the very architecture of a soul. Growth born from pain is distinct from growth driven by ambition alone. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about who you were, what you tolerated, and where you abandoned your own standards on the altar of false peace. You began to notice patterns, moments where you swallowed your words when you should have spoken them, times you compromised a core value to avoid conflict. You examined these not with self-loathing, but with a clarifying honesty, for clarity is the non-negotiable foundation of genuine change. While she was replaying old conversations, searching for angles to use against you, you were mining those same moments for their lessons. You asked yourself the harder questions. Why did I allow that? Why did I ignore my own intuition? Why did I trade self-respect for temporary harmony? These questions are painful, but they are also liberating. They shift the locus of control back to its rightful place, within you. Rebuilding requires a discipline that feels monastic. It means waking each day and choosing actions that align with the person you are becoming, not the person you were when you were wounded. You started setting boundaries that felt foreign and uncomfortable at first. You said no without appending a novel of explanation. You stopped seeking permission to take up space in the world. From the outside, these changes might have looked small, even insignificant. Internally, they were seismic shifts in your tectonic plates. Concurrently, you learned to regulate your emotions instead of outsourcing that responsibility to anyone else. You felt the anger, the grief, the confusion. Oh, you felt them all. But you did not let them take the wheel. You observed them, you sat with them, you integrated them. This is not suppression, it is the pinnacle of maturity. It is the ability to feel deeply without becoming destructive. She mistook your quiet for weakness. Many do. They assume that if someone isn't broadcasting their pain, they must not be processing it. In reality, you were doing the exact opposite. You were alchemizing pain into structure. You were building routines, habits, and principles sturdy enough to carry you forward on days when motivation had deserted you entirely. And here lies the critical divergence. Her energy was perpetually aimed outward, straining to control the narrative, manipulate perceptions, punish you for moving on. Your energy was focused inward, fortifying your character, sharpening your judgment, restoring your self-respect. Outward focus breeds chaos and exhaustion. Inward focus breeds a deep, unshakable competence. As you rebuilt, a subtle but monumental shift occurred. Your identity ceased to revolve around being understood by her. You no longer needed her to see your worth for that worth to be real, solid, and undeniable. That single shift stripped her efforts of all their intended potency. For manipulation only works on those still seeking validation from the manipulator. You also learned to tolerate loneliness without letting it curdle into desperation. This is a rare and powerful skill. Many cling to toxic dynamics simply because they fear the void that follows letting go. You faced that void directly. You sat in its silence, and instead of rushing to fill it with noise or distraction, you filled it with purpose. Purpose doesn't need to be grand. Sometimes it is simply the daily decision to live honestly, to align your actions with your words, to stop betraying yourself in 1,000 small ways. These decisions compound over time. They make you predictable in the very best sense, stable, trustworthy, grounded. While she was escalating, you were stabilizing. While she was reacting, you were responding. While she was trying to win, you were trying to become someone you could respect. This fundamental difference in orientation determines the outcome long before the conflict ever becomes visible to the outside world. What she never anticipated was that your growth would render you unreachable. Not cold or emotionally distant, but psychologically anchored. Her accusations no longer had the power to define you. Her anger no longer sparked fear in you, not because you had grown numb, but because you had become solid. You had density. This reconstruction meant accepting difficult truths, that not everyone who walks away is in the wrong, and not everyone who stays is loyal. You refined your discernment to a fine edge. You learned to distinguish between people who challenge you to grow and people who merely provoke you to react. This newfound awareness irrevocably changed the quality of all your relationships going forward. In the end, her attempts to harm you were directed at an outdated version of who you were. She was attacking a ghost, a shadow from a past you were steadily leaving behind. Meanwhile, you were becoming someone new, less reactive, more responsible, far more resilient. This was the quiet victory she never saw coming. While she tried to break you, you were building a foundation strong enough to stand on, without her, without applause, and without fear. Her anger could not stay concealed forever. Anger never does. No matter how artfully someone tries to dress it up as concern, justice, or moral duty, it seeps through the seams. It reveals itself in the urgency of their words, in the way every conversation, no matter how unrelated, somehow loops back to the same grievance in an intensity that feels disproportionate off-key. While she believed she was being strategic, she was slowly, steadily exposing the raw nerve beneath the strategy. When someone acts from a place of rage, they lose the ability to measure. Everything becomes excessive, their timing is awkward, their reactions are too sharp like a flinch to a tap. Their storytelling grows dramatic, repetitive, and fatally inconsistent. At first, people may listen out of curiosity or a sense of obligation, but over time, patterns emerge. And patterns make people instinctively uneasy. She spoke too often. She explained too much. She required others to validate her version of events not once, but repeatedly, as if their affirmation was a drug she needed constant hits of. That need is itself a revelation. Calm confidence does not require an audience. It does not beg for agreement. It does not chase credibility. It simply is. Her anger, however, demanded witnesses. The more she tried to frame you as the problem, the more her own emotional investment became the main event. Neutral observers began to notice the stark contrast. You were not responding in kind. You were not mounting counterattacks. You were not trying to control the narrative. This contrast held immense power. People instinctively trust restraint more than aggression. Silence, when paired with unwavering consistency, carries a weight that shouting can never achieve. Anger also acts as a corrosive on memory. Details blur, alter, expand, or are conveniently forgotten. Stories shift subtly depending on the listener. This inconsistency might seem minor in isolation, but it accumulates grain by grain until it forms a hill of doubt. Once that doubt takes root, it spreads quietly, undermining not with a roar but with a whisper. She underestimated the collective emotional intelligence of those around her. Most people have tasted resentment before. They recognize its bitter aftertaste. They sense when something is being pushed too hard, too insistently. Even if they never voice a challenge, they register it internally. Her tone, her fixation, her sheer inability to let go all transmitted the same subconscious signal. This is personal. This is unresolved. This is not as clean as it is being presented. Meanwhile, your behavior remained, in the most beautiful way, boring. You showed up where it mattered. You handled your responsibilities with quiet competence. You treated people with a steady respect. You did not perform innocence or parade a victimhood. You simply lived your life. Over time, that stability spoke with a louder, clearer voice than any accusation ever could. A psychological principle was at work here. When someone is genuinely wronged and secure in their own truth, they do not need to destroy the other person to restore balance. They seek resolution, or if that is impossible, they create distance. When someone is driven by resentment, however, they crave punishment. They need the other person to suffer, visibly and undeniably. That desire is terribly difficult to conceal, and it makes onlookers profoundly uneasy. Her rage also narrowed her social awareness to a dangerous tunnel vision. She began to assume agreement instead of earning it. She spoke as if her conclusions were self-evident facts, but people resist being told what to think, especially when the messenger is vibrating with unchecked emotion. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, support cooled. Conversations grew shorter, more formal. Interest waned. Not because people had explicitly taken your side, but because they had instinctively distanced themselves from the heat of her intensity. This is how character is truly revealed, not in grand, cinematic exposures, but in the small, daily feedback loops of human interaction. Who do people trust? Who do they avoid? Who do they listen to with a subtle, unspoken caution? Rage accelerates this process. It compresses into months what might otherwise take years to surface. She believed she was exposing you. In reality, she was revealing her own inability to regulate her emotions. That inability manifested as urgency, a need for control, and a moral certainty devoid of humility, traits that over time erode authority rather than establish it. What she did not foresee was that your restraint would function as a flawless mirror. The calmer you remained, the louder and more unhinged her anger sounded by comparison. The more grounded you appeared, the more erratic her behavior seemed. This isn't about claiming moral superiority, it is about the unforgiving nature of contrast. And in that stark contrast, the truth became evident to anyone willing to see. Eventually, people stopped asking questions. They had seen enough. Not enough to stage an intervention or condemn her outright, but enough to doubt the story she was selling. Enough to take her words with a grain of salt. Enough to trust their own observations over her impassioned narration. The cruel final irony is that if she had stepped back, processed her anger privately, and simply let go, her credibility might have remained intact. But rage is not patient. It demands expression. It insists on immediate action, and in acting without restraint, she meticulously dismantled her own case. You did not need to mount a defense. Her own behavior did that for you. Over time, the fog lifted. The noise faded to a distant hum. What remained in the minds of those who had watched it unfold was a simple, unspoken conclusion. Whatever had transpired between you two, the one who could not let go was the one revealing the most about themselves. There is a strange and formidable power in refusing to become what someone desperately needs you to be. When she expected anger and received peace, when she anticipated defensiveness and met with silence, when she prepared for collapse and witnessed unwavering steadiness, the entire architecture of her narrative began to tremble and groan. Her story was a play that required your participation to feel real. Without your outrage, your frantic explanations, your emotional outbursts, the script was just words on a page, devoid of life. People who construct narratives to justify their behavior are, in a sense, playwrights who need their chosen actor to hit their marks. She needed you to be unstable, vindictive, or utterly broken. That performance would have been her confirmation, her proof of concept. But you denied her that. You stayed composed. You remained measured. That refusal didn't just reject a role, it dismantled the entire stage. Your non-reaction created a vacuum. And in that vacuum, her own behavior became the loudest, most conspicuous thing in the room. Every extra message, every exaggerated claim, every attempt to provoke you now stood isolated and exposed, stripped of the context of a fight. What might have once looked like a messy conflict between two people slowly revealed its true nature, a one-sided obsession. Retaliation would have been the easy path. You had the material, you had the justification. You could have pointed out her contradictions, exposed her motivations, and defended your name with aggressive fervor. But that retaliation would have kept you trapped in the very emotional battlefield she was trying to dominate. It would have meant you were still playing her game, just by different rules. Instead, you chose the harder, higher road of restraint. And that single choice transformed the entire power dynamic. By not reacting, you forced observers to rely solely on what they could see and verify, rather than on what they were being told. And what they saw was one person continuing to live with integrity and another person who could not stop fighting a battle that was, for all intents and purposes, already over. That contrast communicated volumes without uttering a single word. Your silence was not passive, it was fiercely intentional. You were not avoiding the truth, you were refusing to distort it by wrestling with lies in the mud. You understood that truth, when supported by consistent action, does not require amplification. It resonates on its own frequency. Over time, that consistency becomes its own evidence, a testimony more reliable than any passionate speech. She mistook your composure for indifference. In reality, it was the highest form of discipline. You felt the urge to defend yourself, of course you did. You felt the sting of injustice, the heat of frustration. But you chose, again and again, not to act on that impulse. That repeated choice built a wall of protection around your peace. Emotional self-control is an invisible force in the moment, but its effects accumulate quietly, building into something unassailable. The more she pushed against this wall of silence, the more unbalanced she appeared. Anger escalates when it meets no resistance. It has nothing to push against, so it turns inward, becoming frantic, searching for new angles, new weapons. She tried harder. She spoke louder. She drew more people into the drama. Each escalation made the situation less about any original transgression and more about her own incapacity to release her grip. People notice patterns, even when they don't comment on them. They noticed who kept raising the stakes and who held steady. They noticed who seemed invested in destruction and who seemed invested in building a future. Those silent observations are what shape lasting trust and judgment over time. By refusing to collapse, you also refused to confirm her most deeply held belief, that you were weak, that you were dependent on her narrative. This was perhaps the most destabilizing blow of all. She expected you to need her validation, to crave vindication from the court of public opinion. When you demonstrated that you did not, it shattered her sense of importance in your life's equation. There is a profound psychological cost to chasing someone who will not engage. It forces a brutal self-awareness. It exposes the utter absence of leverage. That exposure is agonizing for those who derive power from emotional control, and rather than sit with that agony, they typically externalize it with even greater force. What you witnessed was precisely that externalization, the flailing of a person who had lost her footing. Your refusal to react did not render you invisible. On the contrary, it made you deeply credible. People trust those who can withstand pressure without fracturing. They trust those who do not need to shout to be heard, whose presence speaks with the quiet authority of self-possession. Over time, your behavior built a quiet reputation, a reputation of resilience and integrity that could not be unraveled by accusation alone. In the end, her narrative collapsed not because you argued it down, but because it could not survive without your energetic participation. Stories fueled by resentment are like fire. They require constant fuel. When you stopped feeding it with your reactions, it consumed its own source and burned itself out. You did not win by defeating her. You won by steadfastly refusing to become a version of her. And that choice preserved something infinitely more valuable than a spotless reputation. It preserved the sanctity of your own character. What she never could have anticipated was that the very pressure she applied would act less like a hammer and more like a forge. She believed that sufficient force, hostility, and calculated harm would cause you to fracture. That is, after all, how brittle structures behave under stress. They crack, they splinter, they collapse, but you were not a brittle structure. You were something alive, adaptable. And strong, living things respond to pressure differently. They reorganize, they adapt. They become denser, more resilient. This is exactly what happened within you. Every attempt to undermine you forced a clarifying question: who am I and what do I stand for? When lies swirled around your name, you had to decide whether your identity would be defined by external noise or by your own consistent conduct. When attacks questioned your worth, you were pushed to ground that worth in something deeper, something far more reliable than the shifting opinions of others. This process was not comfortable. It was brutal, grueling work, but it was profoundly formative. Suffering, when faced with clear-eyed honesty, acts as a great stripper of illusions. It burns away what is non-essential and exposes the core of what remains. You learned with swift certainty that external validation is a fickle foundation. It shifts with moods, alliances, and convenience. So you stopped building your self-image upon the sand of praise or blame. You anchored it in bedrock principles, in the quiet knowledge that you were acting in alignment with your values, even when it came at a social cost. That internal shift changed everything. When someone tries to ruin you, they operate on the expectation of fear. They expect you to scramble, to negotiate, to trade fragments of your integrity for momentary relief. You refused that bargain, and in that refusal you discovered a terrifying and beautiful power. You could survive disapproval. You could tolerate being misunderstood. You could endure injustice without letting it poison you into bitterness. This capacity hardened you in the right way, not into cynicism, not into a closed heart, but into precision. You became more discerning about who earned your trust, more intentional about where you invested your precious energy. You learned that access to your inner world is a sacred privilege, not a common right, and you stopped granting it to those who treated it with carelessness. Her hostility, ironically, sharpened your perception to a razor's edge. You began to see the early warning signs of manipulation faster. You recognized patterns where you once saw only isolated incidents. You noticed the subtle, and not so subtle, disconnects between people's words and their actions. This wasn't paranoia, it was discernment, earned through the costly tuition of experience. Pain, when integrated and studied, teaches unparalleled pattern recognition, and that skill protects you long after the original threat has faded into memory. What she intended as your destruction forced you into a premature and powerful maturity. You became less reactive because you saw that reaction was a tool that served her, not you. You became more deliberate because you understood that impulse carried too high a cost. You learned the profound power of the pause, to think several moves ahead, to choose responses that served your long-term character rather than offered short-term emotional relief. This is the precise point where her plan met its ultimate failure. She wanted to reduce you to a raw, reactive emotion. Instead, she pushed you directly toward the one thing she could not comprehend: profound personal responsibility. And responsibility is where true, unassailable strength resides. not in the ability to dominate others, but in the ability to govern yourself with wisdom and grace, especially when no one else is watching. You also discovered that your capacity to endure was far greater than you had ever imagined. Each attempt to destabilize you became, in retrospect, another piece of evidence of your own resilience. You did not merely survive the pressure, you adapted to it. You became someone who could remain functional under stress, clear-minded under attack, and grounded when the world felt fundamentally unfair. That kind of resilience alters your entire orientation to life. You no longer feel the compulsive need to prove yourself. You no longer panic when challenged. You no longer mistake interpersonal conflict for personal catastrophe. You now know in your bones what you can handle, and that knowledge is unshakable. The final, quiet transformation was the most decisive of all. You stopped defining victory as being seen as right or vindicated. Victory quietly redefined itself as living well, as acting with integrity even in the smallest moments, as building a life so sturdy, so authentic, that it could withstand any scrutiny, even and especially when no one was there to scrutinize it at all. That internal orientation rendered you truly untouchable in ways her imagination could never have conjured. She wanted to ruin you. Instead, she became the inadvertent catalyst for your most profound transformation. She forced you to confront yourself, to refine yourself, to strengthen yourself in the fire. And once that alchemical process began, it did not cease when her anger finally sputtered out. That is the part she will never understand. External damage can destroy what is shallow and poorly built. But when immense pressure meets a character willing to be forged, it does not cause collapse. It does something else entirely. It reveals the true metal beneath the surface. It tempers it. It strengthens it. And it leaves behind a person who no longer needs to fear the prospect of being ruined. For they have already passed through the fire and emerged, not scorched, but solidified.